Welcome everybody to this new series. Thank you so much for coming here. This is the first in a new series of events that we're launching titled Doing Better. Anna Gott is our hostess and producer and promoter through the Interintellect, and I'm your host. My name is Jason Crawford. I write The Roots of Progress, which is a website about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress. This is, like I said, the first in a series, so we've got a number of events coming up. This is our May event. In June, we are going to have an event Doing Better at Staying Optimistic with Trevor McKendrick and Tamara Winter, who will talk about the concept of optimism, how it applies today, how we think about it, and especially, how and why to stay optimistic even in hard times. And then in July, we're going to have an event Doing Better at Teaching Progress, where we talk about how progress, the idea of human progress, relates to education. Is it a subject that we should teach? Or, the fact that people don't, I would contend, appreciate progress today as much as they ought to, is that a failure of our educational system? And what should we do about that? How should our educational system be preparing people to understand and appreciate progress? So just to begin, the first question I'd like to start off with for our panelists is just a kind of very broad, open, what do you see as working well in the research funding landscape today? And what's working not so well? Where do you see room for improvement?
A lot more difficult to get money for things that are not nearly as sexy. So if it's something that's basic science that maybe is not necessarily directly correlative to a disease, or could make a drug, or could produce a patent, it's sometimes much more difficult to get funding for that. It's also more difficult.
that term translational. Can you explain?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, anything that can go basically from a discovery in a lab. Maybe they're looking, for example, for a protein that's causative in why we get dementia as we're getting older. So something that would be relevant to eventually developing a drug, which would therefore improve humans, but on the university side also bring in capital for the university.
Mm-hmm. I hear this complaint a lot that there's a lot of funding for translational research, and maybe it's harder to get funding for what would be the opposite, basic science?
Yeah, just kind of science for science's sake. We're just looking at very kind of fundamental questions that are often very important, but aren't obviously important when you embark on them.
If everybody this seems to be general knowledge that this is, that there's like a disproportionately much maybe funding for translational research. If everybody knows this is a problem, why is it so hard to solve?
Well, I mean, it's probably for, every 10 basic science projects you take on, one might bring something that is, eventually going to help people. But so one of the ethical questions is, well, if you have $10 million, shouldn't you put $10 million into curing Parkinson's, which plenty of people die of every year and of which we have no drug for? Or should you put it into figuring out why this plant is that green versus another shade of green, which might actually bring some cool insight, but it also might tell us nothing besides why the plant is green.
Right. Michael, do you want to weigh in? What's working well today? What's working not so well?
I mean, something that has, in some ways, is a really big success. I guess over the last 50 odd years, I think on average, research funding grows about 3 to 4% ahead of inflation each year. So we have this kind of, really incredible investment that humanity makes as a whole. It depends a bit on what you count, but it's probably about $400 billion a year goes into research. And well, that's a lot of money. And I think it's something that if you were to look from the perspective of, say, a century ago, would really look like an incredible change. The fact that collectively humanity has made this just enormous commitment of kind of, its wealth towards the research landscape. Celine's comment, this kind of division between basic and more applied research, it's a really interesting one. And I guess I kind of want to echo the comment and maybe go and sort of take it a little bit further. You asked the question, Jason, how, why is the balance kind of the way it is? And of course, part of the trouble is that it's so incredibly difficult to make the case for basic research. You know, there's this famous story that Michael Faraday, one of the founders of, well, sort of the modern theory of electromagnetism, you know, was asked by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, you know, why was he doing what he was doing, these very strange experiments? And he said, sir, one day you shall tax them. You know, of course, he was right, but it took about sort of 70 odd more years before that even started to be true. When you're asking these really very basic questions about, you know, what are the categories in nature, what are the fundamental principles, they are not directly connected to any kind of technology. They're not connected to any economic impact. They're not connected to any immediate social impact. But over 50 or 100 years, they can utterly transform all of those things. And that's just a much harder story to tell. It's a much harder political story to tell if ultimately you're getting a lot of the funding from government. And I think that's why it's such a difficult thing to do.
So that story about Faraday was doing his work in the early 1800s, right? So one of his biggest discoveries of electromagnetism was like 1831, I think. At that point, you know, the world really had not seen science burst into technology in a big way. That was going to wait until the mid to, you know, late 1800s, I could argue, right? That people really started seeing, oh, wow, chemistry and electricity and other transforming the world. It's now almost 200 years later, right? Haven't we learned this lesson by now? Like we can see now the link between basic research and ultimately progress in the world.
I mean, there's lots of things where, you know, it's one thing to see it, it's another thing to act on it in the short term. So, you know, you formulate the theory of quantum mechanics in the mid 1920s and you get the transistor in the late 1940s. You know, big win, but and you might argue that at the time, you know, there had already been enough sort of example technologies that, and social benefits that maybe it should have been foreseeable that there would be such big wins. Because in the moment, who's responsible for that? Who's going to say, I'm willing to, you know, place a bet that in 25 years' time, we'll get some enormous social return? And you know, which organization do you point to? Of course, we do have organisations that at least in some regards attempt to do that. But I think it's a hard case. It's a hard case to make to a voter, and I think sort of reasonably so.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how you never
something to add
for hiring McKinsey to answer a strategic problem, right? Like you're not going to get fired for funneling money towards Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. The, you know, voters aren't going to vote you out for funding that.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes I wonder if we have a problem with sort of how asymmetric upside and asymmetric downside risk is, you know, how our funders in government and even private foundations, you know, face sort of asymmetric upside versus downside in funding, you know, especially kind of high risk, high reward ideas. Michael, you mentioned that we've been, you know, that funding has been growing, funding for science has been growing, and it's even been growing faster than inflation. But you also have written some things that argue that even though the funding is growing, we're not actually getting more or better science out of it, that research productivity is not growing or arguably is even slowing down. Do you want to make the case for that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, because it's phenomenally difficult to analyze these questions. You can't say what it means for one discovery to be more important than another. So there's this, you know, just terrible sort of lack of a feedback loop. If you can't say what it means to be doing better in a really precise and satisfying way, it's very difficult to monitor the health of science in general. But there are all these kind of indirect suggestions or sort of proxy measures that suggest that maybe innovation is slowing. I guess one that economists like to use is what they call total factor productivity. So it's essentially as many of you know, it's the parts of GDP growth that seem to be mostly accounted for by the production of new ideas. So not the increase in capital, not the increase in labor, but the increase in ingenuity and things like that. And TFP growth is way down over the last 40 or 50 years. And there's several measures in that general vein, which, when you compare them to the 1950s, 1960s, really are, in some cases, almost an order of magnitude down. So that is suggestive, at least, that somehow we're having more trouble, or we're needing to spend more money per sort of unit of progress, or expend more effort. Another sort of two other examples to give you the sort of the flavour of the indirect argument here. One is just that the age at which people make Nobel Prize-winning discoveries has increased enormously. It's increased actually by almost a quarter of the length of a scientist's career. And another similar kind of a fact, I don't remember off the top of my head, but something like, I think the size of a typical team has gone up by something like on the order of a factor of 4. Which is also suggesting that it's just becoming, it may just be becoming more difficult to make progress.
Yeah, certainly. There was a time when Faraday could sort of play around with magnets on his table and discover fundamental laws of physics, and now we need like thousands of people building LHC and LIGO and over decades and spending billions of dollars. Yeah. Celine, what do you think about this question? Is research productivity slowing down?
I hate this question. This is like such
Great. Tell me why you hate the question. Maybe that'll be even more interesting. Why do you hate the question?
I agree with Michael. I think it's just a problem. Like, a good metaphor is gene therapy. So my PhD was on the economics of gene therapy. Gene therapy is basically a way of fixing diseases that are caused by issues in our DNA. So we can be born with a lot of kind of mutations that cause you to go blind, or have this disease or another that is, not traditionally treatable with normal drugs, a drug that you might take by your mouth, for example. And so the field's been around for 25 years, 30 years, and we've had, the first gene therapies come on market, and they're all for the simplest iterations of this, right? So I worked on a drug for choroideremia, which is a form of blindness that's caused by one little DNA base pair being modified that causes the disease. And there's a few others like that. So we've had now drugs for basically all of those diseases have been figured out, understood, and they're, in patients and going to be on market soon and saving lives, which is great. Next is the more complex diseases. So there are things that are caused by 2 genes, 4 genes, 10 genes, 20 genes, and just it takes a longer time to bring any of those gene therapies to market, not because progress is slower, but because incremental progress, the amount of work it takes to develop a gene therapy for pancreatic cancer is, an order of magnitude more difficult, multiple orders of magnitude more difficult. So if you use the same measurements, it looks like it's slowing down, it looks like it's taking longer, but it's not actually at all. You're just, the mountain's steeper now. And I think that's probably true in a lot of different fields.
Yeah, all of this seems to point in general to a kind of low-hanging fruit type of hypothesis, which I think, Michael, he's shaking his head. Okay, so Michael, I thought you and so for context for the audience, Michael Nielsen and Patrick Collison published something in The Atlantic about a year ago on this question, and actually showing some data from a survey of scientists about Nobel Prizes and so forth. But that was the low-hanging fruit hypothesis is how I interpreted your discussion of the kind of discovering new continents. But maybe, tell me why you're shaking your head when I even bring that up.
So, one standard response is just to say, it's getting harder because people do the easy thing first. And that is certainly true in some domains. It is also certainly false in some other domains. If you think about, I'll give you an example. Mathematical logic in the start of the 20th century was gradually getting harder and harder because logicians had solved more and more of the easy problems, and so it was getting sort of more and more challenging. And then as a result of kind of a long chain of problems, Turing and Church in the mid-1930s invented modern computing, sort of really as an outgrowth of mathematical logic. And all of a sudden, there were all these incredibly easy problems were revealed, and there's this massive spurt of progress. And this happens over and over and over again, where you have, fields apparently seem to be getting complicated and harder, and then you have the birth of new fields out of those, where all of a sudden there's tons of low-hanging fruit revealed. So I don't really buy that, or necessarily that this is an intrinsic state of affairs. Sometimes there are really easy things that we could just do if only we could see them, but we can't see them yet, and that's the fundamental problem. So you ask the question, where do new fields come from? This is a question that has received really surprisingly little discussion as far as I can tell. And even a sort of a very simple question like, how would you 10x the rate of field production, new field production, is I think it's a fun thing to think about. In some ways, that's saying how could you really greatly broaden sort of the range of low-hanging fruit, to return to the metaphor you started with.
Yeah.
Michael, do you think that's so? While you're talking, I was trying to like model that in my head to bio. I was like, okay, well, so gene therapy is facilitated by AAVs, the ability of them to carry genetic information to the cell. And so that was a leap. So then you could argue that was the progress, and then the low-hanging fruit was facilitated. I don't know. I'd be curious your thoughts on how it applies to bio specifically.
Unfortunately, I'm so incredibly ignorant of biology that it's hard.
I'm nerd in math, so.
To make examples. I mean, an example, I think in some regards, is the immune system. This is this, kind of invisible system. It's not necessarily apparent at all that you have such a thing. You can't point to, well, I don't know, there are some organs, obviously, that play a very important role, but you can't point to a particular thing, the kidneys or whatever. I think it's just amazing that, there were these discoveries, relatively recent discoveries, where people understood the role that immunoglobulin and things like this played, and then this sort of gradual discovery that the immune system has got to be one of the most complicated things in the universe, and of course it's this amazing open field that it wasn't even obvious it was there at all. I don't know if that's kind of a satisfying example or not.
No, I don't necessarily agree or disagree with you. I'm trying to figure out where I land on this one. Because for example, like the ability to like quantify the immune system is only in part possible for like new analytical techniques, for example. So I don't like it. So now that we understand like T cells and create CAR T, like that is low hanging fruit, but it's like bolstered up by the ability to quantify all these things.
Can I give a better example? I think than the immune system is just. There's this sort of very strange prehistory to CRISPR, particularly all this sort of work that the yogurt companies did, essentially trying to figure out how to solve this apparently very detailed industrial problem of how to keep the yogurt in their vats from going off, and of course ultimately this it seems like a lot of detail. It seems like an awful lot of in the weeds work. And ultimately helped lead to the discovery of CRISPR, and again you kind of have this sort of wide open field.
Came from yogurt.
Yeah, basically you can. It's not really. It was an IAP9, I think. Was discovered in another context, but then there's a line of yogurt companies that essentially they're trying to build artificial immune systems for the yogurt to keep the vats from going off, and they actually pioneered a whole lot of the techniques. I mean, they're doing a kind of genetic engineering on the vats that I am told led to CRISPR. By the way, just a fun fact I can't resist mentioning is that apparently when you eat yogurt or cheese, you're almost always eating CRISPR food.
It's very expensive to manufacture CRISPR drugs, so should value that yogurt even more now.
That's fascinating also because yogurt, of course, is a fermentation product. And it was work on fermentation products like vinegar, wine, and beer that led Louis Pasteur to breakthroughs in microbiology, including essentially the discovery of anaerobic metabolism. So maybe the big lesson here is that for biological breakthroughs, we should be doing more work on industrial fermentation process.
Do you volunteer as tribute, Jason?
There's a big proposal recently that made the news. Some congressman or senator perhaps has a proposal to dramatically increase the budget of the NSF, the National Science Foundation, give it something like $100 billion over 5 years. I think ramping its budget up to something that would be much more comparable to NIH. For context, for those who aren't familiar with the numbers, the budget of the NIH, National Institutes of Health, is around $41 billion this year or last year. The NSF, National Science Foundation, which funds sort of like everything that's not health, has a budget of $7.5 billion, around there. And so this proposal would ramp up the NSF's budget, but also I believe would expand its responsibilities to being more responsibility for technology, for applied or translational work, not just basic science. Thoughts on this? Celine, maybe, do you want to start?
I don't know if I have a very specific thought besides more capital for research is better, but I mean, I haven't looked into the specifics of how they're proposing to use the money, so I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. Michael, do you have any thoughts?
Two thoughts. One is that, you know, between 1998 and 2003, the NIH budget was doubled. And it's pretty interesting to think about what the impact of that was. It had some really positive impacts, and it had, I think, some really negative impacts. Whenever there's a whole lot of new money for anything, you want to ask the question, you know, the new stuff that you're funding, why were you not funding it before? If somebody gives you $1,000 to buy something, and then they give you another $1,000, you know, the second $1,000 you're going to spend on the things you didn't want with the first 1,000. And I'm not saying
classic diminishing returns.
What's going to happen. It's the diminishing returns argument. And it's, I don't know, you know, I certainly hope that some lessons will be learned from the NIH budget doubling. A lot of things that people hoped would be achieved by the NIH budget doubling were not achieved. There were people who were keen on the idea that it might help address the problem that younger scientists were not receiving grants. You know, sort of notoriously difficult to get an NIH grant until quite late in your career. That did not happen. Other people thought that it would maybe help with the problem. I mean, just simply the low granting rate. And again, transient effect, it did help, but over the long term, rates are lower than ever. So it sort of suggests that if you simply do these massive increases in a thoughtless way or not learning enough from the past, you're not necessarily going to solve the problems that you're hoping to solve. And the second thought is that the way they're structuring it, they're going to focus on 10 particular areas. I can't remember what the areas are. They're things like my old home of quantum computing and artificial intelligence and sort of mostly fashionable New York Times kind of technology areas. And they're all great areas, and I'm very keen on all those areas. I do wonder how they're going to be kept fresh. There's some sort of vague talk about how they're going to update the focus areas. It's not very clear what that process will be. It's also not clear that much money is going to, you know, go to support areas which are going to be, you know, seen as crucial in 30 or 40 years' time. Just to give an example, something that Canada did that was very clever in the 1980s, they scooped up a whole bunch of the leading AI researchers at a time when AI was not particularly fashionable through the 80s and 90s. And now that looks like a fantastic investment. But you know, that required, I think, quite a bit of foresight on their part and really a long-term view. But doing the fashionable thing is not always that's not the only place you want to spend your money. And it looks to me a little bit like there's a lot of focus on doing what is fashionable and maybe not quite as much focus as I would like to see on doing, well, unfashionable things.
I wonder if that's just a strategy to get it pushed through our political system, though. I guess it depends how much control the leaders at NSF actually have in 5 years from now.
Sorry, Celine, I actually didn't say that again. I don't think I got
Sorry, I was just saying, like, I don't know if they did this, but I wonder if the kind of focus areas being traditionally fashionable, something that, the average person could hear and be like, oh yeah, that seems like a good thing to spend money on, is less the ideals at NSF or kind of where they're hoping to go and more kind of a strategy to get it through our political system, which does not like to fund science.
Yeah.
Right. Like you've even seen it was a space launch yesterday. Like it's become very politicalized, and I'm glad if that's what it takes for us to go to to ISS on our own. Like great, but yeah, I always have a little bit of skepticism around things because of that.
Yeah. How can we how can we make science less politicized or less maybe subject to sort of, I don't know, short-term whims of Congress or the mood of the public? How can we sort of make it based on better judgment?
In companies where they've had famously good R&D teams and famously good research, the reason why is because it was led by scientists and not interfered by the money men or the CEOs or the management consultants, any of that. So I'm guessing that would be the way to do it here. But that also, there's a lot of very optimistic ways in which science can be done more efficiently and effectively, and less influenced by factors that aren't actually relevant to developing better medicines or making key biological discoveries. They all also seem highly unlikely to actually occur, unfortunately.
Yeah.
You really have
sort
to.
Of the. Sorry, you really have to.
You really have to kind of fit to. It's the same thing in Valley, right? Like if you want to. I want to work on aging drugs, and I found a way that works on aging drugs that I think makes sense from a biological standpoint, but also makes sense from a venture capital and returning capital standpoint, and sexy on a portfolio page standpoint, which is a construction that I had to have if I wanted to have money to do my thing.
Yeah. So you have this really interesting perspective, having done the grad work in health economics, also having been a biotech investor and a biotech founder. Tell me some about maybe the for-profit versus the nonprofit side of funding things in the health or bio area.
If we're saying that nonprofit is or governmental funding is translational focus, it's 10 times more on the for-profit side, right? This is actually something that I've really had to work on with my scientific team at Celevity to really not make them feel kind of dispassionate or unheard, because they'll come up with these amazing ideas, but it will be, there might be patent challenges, or it might be a level of biological risk that I don't feel comfortable taking at this stage, or I can't, from a fiduciary duty standpoint, take at this stage. And it's all kind of in the focus of what can we get to market to hit the next milestone, to raise more capital, to eventually get nearer to an exit. And it kind of all of our biology is with that lens. And it obviously also is a lens of, doing biological good and bringing better medicines forward. But you really have to think about that constantly. And often a lot of biotech companies or very early stage biotech startups don't do well or fail because they're so science first, which obviously you want to be if you're a scientist, like I do too, but you have to take in that commercial consideration if you actually want to have the capital to do the thing that you want to do for the next few years.
Yeah. Where would you say is the best, who's the most willing to fund wacky, contrarian, kind of risky, moonshot, high risk, high reward type stuff?
In VCs or in general?
In general, sort of of all the different places. If I have a wacky biotech or, moonshot, would it be NIH? Would it be a biotech VC? Would it be the Gates Foundation? Would it, I don't know.
I think it's rich individuals who care. So there's a whole gene therapy program for glioblastoma at UCSF because somebody, a very wealthy family in San Francisco, I believe had a family member die from glioblastoma. For chronic glioblastoma is one of the most deadly brain cancers. It kills you in about 6 months and nothing works against it. Wow. That's the same thing as aging. A lot of aging work is funded by people who have made a lot of money in other ways and realize that doesn't actually stop you from, not getting sick as you get older.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's sort of the theme is sort of it's the people who aren't accountable to anybody else and don't have to prove, right? Don't have to justify their investment. If it's just one, rich person or couple, they can kind of spend the money however they want. And does that resonate with you?
From my perspective, but I'm much more commercial than Michael is. So I'd be curious what Michael
is. What about the funding landscape for longevity research in particular? So this is something, again, that you do sort of both as a founder and as an investor. Is longevity research, it feels to me like one of these things that for social or cultural reasons might be underfunded? What's your take?
I mean, it depends what you define as longevity research, right? NIA largely does neurodegenerative disorder funding. I want to say it was like 70 or 80% of their grants. Oh, National Institutes for Aging, which is the government's kind of not-for-profit, obviously, sector for funding this kind of stuff. Largely goes towards those diseases, but those are aging diseases, but they're very specific aging indications. You could say that any like cancer funding is for aging, although usually the mechanisms by which they're targeting it aren't usually like an aging drug. In my view, is something that's targeting the underlying ways in which we age, and then the secondary question is, okay, what is the disease you use it for? Versus a lot of the funding right now is, here's a disease, let's figure out what's the best way to drug it. On the private side, it's super sexy, especially now. And so if you're kind of good at talking about it, there's a lot of money on the tech and biotech side, which is actually a bit uncommon. It's often a little bit more difficult to get biotech funding from tech VCs, but everyone's very primed in San Francisco to think about longevity science.
Yeah, cool. Just want to remind everybody that we do have, we're using Slido to take questions. We've got several questions for the audience, which we'll be getting to in a little bit. But go ahead, and if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them there. Anna put the link in the chat, and feel free to please look over everybody else's questions also, and sort of vote on the ones that you're most interested in, and then we can answer some of the most popular ones.
Yes, we have a lot of, sorry, just a note on the questions. So we have quite a bit of a good list of questions, but we haven't had any voting yet. So everybody is very chill, which is good, but that means that we will ask questions in a chronological way. So if you want to change that, there's a way to intervene. Head over to Slido.
Michael, you mentioned, you brought up the topic earlier of new fields and new field creation. And I guess it's maybe it was part of your answer to the low-hanging fruit question. So maybe one way to look at this, maybe to sort of resolve the paradox, is like maybe every individual field, or at least if you construe it narrowly enough, runs out of low-hanging fruit, but there's new fields to discover, and every new field, maybe has new low-hanging fruit. So let's talk about how new fields get created and funded. David Deutsch said, he put this thing out on Twitter. He said, I spoke recently to a member of the panel that awarded me my first research grant on quantum computers in 1985. He said it was a close run thing. I asked if I would have gotten it under today's criteria, and he said no chance. I could basically tick none of the boxes. So comment on this. Do we have a problem funding new fields?
I asked him later at T, was that in fact, oh, my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me? Okay, good.
We can now, yeah. Start over though.
Is that in fact none of his? Okay, so I asked David later about that tweet, and he told me that because I was surprised that his work on quantum computing had been funded at all. And in fact, it wasn't funded. The tweet is actually, you've given unfortunately an overly optimistic interpretation. That was his later work on quantum computing. He didn't bother submitting a grant for any of his early thinking about it. He effectively invented the field of quantum computing with no research support at all. So in fact, the timing of it, 1985, that was when his first paper had appeared. When he made his first grant application. And I think this is a very, very common pattern that, in fact, the foundational work in almost all fields is often essentially unsupported. I mentioned the examples before of Church and Turing. Same story there, essentially unfunded. And
Shannon doing information theory.
Exactly. And I think when you start to think about, the reasons why this is the case, fields are they're really stories. It's about pointing at something and saying, here's some really fundamental questions, and here's the beginnings of an approach for how you might start to answer those questions. And a grant application is also a story. and you need to connect it to sort of compelling existing narratives. And by definition, you don't have that sort of prior to the field existing. I think it is extremely difficult, I think, to get funding.
Uh-oh, Michael, I think we're losing you. All right, let's, well, while we're waiting for Michael to come back, Celine, do you want to comment? Any thoughts on field?
I think he covered it so well. Jeez.
Michael, are you in a better Wi-Fi spot?
I hope so. We'll see. Okay, you've got
Michael,
me.
we need your academic counterweight.
Okay. Just I guess I was really making the point that grant applications are stories. They're stories about the future, and but fields that when somebody is doing that sort of very difficult foundational work, they by definition don't have the story yet, and so you just can't go to a funder and say, I have some. I mean, in Deutsch's case, I have some very vague thoughts about maybe there's something to do with quantum mechanics and computing. And this is at a time in the late 70s when computers themselves are hardly a thing. You just sound like, I mean, really, what on earth are you talking about? And I think this is a very common kind of a pattern. Very often the foundational papers in fields. Another good example is Turing's first paper on artificial intelligence. It looks almost beyond the pale. There's an extended discussion of the importance of telepathy and whether or not this might perhaps have something to do with whether or not machines are intelligent, right? He had to be all over the place because he was trying to find where the interesting and important things were. But good luck going to a funder with your proposal that speculates on that kind of thing.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. I imagine it can be a little bit easier in bio because you can often wrap things differently than perhaps it is in your field, Michael. Like, for example, if I'm talking to a very conservative pharmaceutical company, I do not say I'm working on dog lifespan extension. I say I am working on a pathway that's well known to be a driver of various malignancies. And that's actually how I'll talk to the FDA too when the time comes. But that's a luxury of bio, I think.
Celine, tell us a bit more about, I'd just love to talk about, there's so many problems that people talk about in sort of health funding in general. There's this thing, eRooms law, which is the, it's more spelled backwards, which is that the price of new drugs keeps going up and up over the years. There's a part of the pharma pipeline that is so difficult to get through that they call it the Valley of Death. There's this well-known challenge around funding vaccines, and you actually wrote some things. You had a blog post about vaccines versus drugs. Maybe tell us some of the things that some of the challenges in sort of the funding that you've thought or researched the most about, or think are some of the most interesting.
Yeah. What's the best one to talk about? Well, what I did my PhD on, or my PhD that could have been Dr. Halioua, was how do healthcare systems pay for expensive preventative medicines? So vaccines are kind of like the canonical preventative medicine, right? You take your shingles vaccine. I got a tetanus vaccine last week, and it means that you are preventing, or hopefully preventing, the onset of disease in the future. But there's a little bit of this weird inverse relationship where the probability of me getting, measles is very low. So the willingness to pay for that vaccine is quite low, but it's okay because vaccines are very cheap. So you still have a very broad adoption of them. But if you make a new vaccine, the actual price somebody is willing to pay for it is, their kind of how damaging that disease is times, how likely the person thinks that they are to get that disease. Versus for something like a therapeutic, the willingness to pay is actually really high, because if you have cancer, if you have X horrible disease, you're willing to pay all the way up to your max willingness to pay. to get rid of that disease. Does that make sense? So there's no multiplier against a therapy like there is for a vaccine. And this is especially hard for kind of any preventative medicine. So the gene therapy I was working on was for choroideremia, which is a blindness disorder that kind of onsets around age 40. So if you have this mutation, you will go blind. You know this for a fact, and it will happen around age 40. But you need to get the therapy when you're 12 or 13 years of age to kind of prevent the onset of degradation that facilitates you becoming blind when you're 40. But a healthcare system has a very hard time paying for something like that, especially in the US, where you kind of bounce from health provider to health provider. So if you say that like Blue Cross Blue Shield pays the $1 million for the gene therapy when you're 15, they're actually not going to get any benefit or any return on their investment, because you're probably going to be with, you know, Medicare, or you're going to be with, you know, Kaiser Permanente by the time you actually end up having the health effect that you're preventing occur. So while the value is very, very high of that drug, and there is a willingness to pay, it's kind of timed badly. Does that make sense? And this is a really huge problem in aging. I think about this a lot in aging. It's actually one of the reasons I went to dogs. So you don't have this problem in dogs. Because, you know, theoretically, you know, if you get a cancer, if you get Parkinson's, you know, that happens when you're older, but the processes that lead up to that are going on for decades before. And so ideally you want to start an intervention decades before you're sick. But you can't, because in addition to all the clinical trial challenges and regulatory challenges and there's also just no willingness to pay. I'm not gonna pay thousands of dollars for a drug that prevents me from maybe getting Parkinson's when I'm 80, despite the fact that I know it would be valuable. And my insurance is definitely not gonna pay for it too.
Yeah. And how do we fix something like that? Are there better models that have been proposed or analyzed?
I mean, I'm a big proponent of single payer, because at least there's one person who's responsible for your health. So in the NHS, it's actually easier to get coverage for things like this, because NHS knows that, you know, they have you when you're 13 and they also have you when you're 70. So while they have budget constraints, they can't afford as many drugs as the US can, which is an important variable to be considered. There is more math. The discount rate on the value of the drug is much lower, because it's the same person who's the same kind of payer that's responsible from now and 30 years from now. But then again, the NHS has a very hard time affording expensive medicines. So the problem then isn't like, are they willing to give the medicine? They're willing to give it, but they can't pay $1 million because they're doing this for everybody. So it's not easy, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I think whether you're a socialist or a libertarian or something in between, I think you can agree that the current system where you're bouncing between providers all the time based on changing jobs is pretty screwed up.
Yeah.
Can I just interject a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Celine, what do you think about models like prizes or patent buyouts?
Or advanced market commitments?
Sorry,
just think ideas like, well, as Jason said, advanced market commitments or patent buyouts or prizes or sort of alternate models that people have proposed.
Can you explain one of them? Like, what do you mean?
Okay, so in the case of a patent buyout, the idea there, really I'm broadly what I'm asking about is sort of alternate models for innovation in that space. An example is patent buyouts, where the government identifies a particular patent as so important for the public that they actually purchase it from the company, and then they make it freely available or available at some nominal charge. Some of the early photography patents, for example, were purchased this way, and that's actually what enabled or helped enable photography to spread very rapidly around the world. I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on sort of any kind of alternate model that you're excited about.
No, okay, so actually, yes. So the whole generics thing is actually kind of what patent buyout isn't necessarily only referring to generics, but it does kind of hit on the generics issue where there are, you know, these huge class of drugs where you can't get patent protection around them anymore. So no pharma company is going to pay to develop them. And the reason why I think about this so much is there's a lot of that around immune aging, which is incredibly relevant right now with COVID, where we, you know, kind of see an exponential death rate with age for a lot of factors, but aging is a huge factor in that. And immune aging is actually shown, or the reduction of immune aging with drugs has actually been shown in model organisms quite a bit. The problem being nobody translates it over, in part because it's shown benefit with drugs that are generic and therefore you'll never make money off of. So more governmental responsibility in terms of owning patents on drugs that either should be broadly applied and available and not necessarily owned by a pharmaceutical company, or are drugs that don't have a financial incentive for a pharmaceutical company but do have a huge financial incentive for a healthcare system. I think is actually super important. Like that whole problem is incredibly frustrating. There are just so many good drugs that just like will never make it forward, and therefore patients who are dying because it was like this huge issue in our system. Patents are also necessary when nobody would invest millions of dollars to develop a drug. So it's a complex one. Everything in the system is complex. That's just the disclaimer around everything that I say.
Thanks.
So let's move on to maybe one last topic before we take some audience questions. Now, this is something, that Michael, you had proposed, and thanks for bringing it up. I'll just phrase it, and I'll just use the words that you used. How best to ensure that science and technology can be used to create a humane and just society? Michael, you proposed this. Do you want to give some of your thoughts?
Sure. It's not a short question, and of course,
not at all.
It's been on my mind a lot the last week in particular, and I think in part because of realizing, somewhat to my shame, that I haven't thought deeply enough about it in the past. And one thing I think in particular that I've been reflecting on is the question of who are the clients of the science and technology institutions, so the research funders, the universities, and so on. So, who ultimately is this work being funded for? Who does it benefit? Does it provide a very decentralized benefit for everybody? What does it do to power imbalances? My background in quantum computing, most of the early work on that was funded by DARPA and by the NSA. And it's most likely, I mean, I can't speak for them, but most likely because they wanted to be able to read your email and, just generally increase surveillance. That's taking in a particular very powerful group of people and giving them much, much more power, potentially. It's interesting to think about other technologies. I've been reflecting on cell phones and the extent to which, I think it's a very complicated and very ambiguous example. To some extent, they provide power to people by enabling them to record people who are in positions of authority and to publicize, just to make open what it is that they're doing. But of course, they can also be used as surveillance technology, which move power towards, again, these sort of very centralized points. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying just trying to understand better who the funders' customers are, for lack of a better term. Famously, DARPA, they have a first customer, which is the US military. It's interesting to think about the question, who is the National Science Foundation's first customer? Who is Harvard University's first customer? They don't really, they don't actually really have sort of single first customers, but they do have, I think, some very large customers. And thinking about governance mechanisms whereby you can ensure that those customers are really sort of serving the broader social good. There's a meeting of the Stanford Faculty Senate the other day, and a whole lot of people at Stanford were talking about it and just complaining that essentially the Faculty Senate was entirely supportive of getting as much money from fossil fuel companies into Stanford as possible. Nobody at all apparently spoke against that. I don't know, that to me speaks to the fact that there's not even a debate, not a proper debate, suggests to me that there's some failure of governance. There's some failure of ensuring that at the Faculty Senate level, enough different interests in society are being represented. So this is very undigested. This is sort of in some ways just my sort of raw thinking, but just trying to understand at that sort of governance level, how can you ensure that enough different voices are getting into the conversation and actually, having an impact. That's kind of the question that's on my mind anyway.
Yeah.
This is something I think about a lot too, because it's very challenging to be in the business of developing better medicines, if that makes sense. And especially, Michael, what you were saying about, you think it was oil companies or gas companies who were to be investing in Stanford. The thing I've thought about a lot actually when I was raising money for my own company is, do you take as much money as you can at the lowest dilution possible, because you're doing a good thing and you want to do a good thing and get as much money as possible to make it as high probability of success as possible, or do you have this responsibility to audit and make sure that the people that you are going to make rich if you're successful, and sure they're not the kind of people that you don't want to kind of support having more capital and more influence and more power in the world. And that kind of tension, at least I found that very difficult, and that's very kind of especially hard to manage in the Valley if you care about things such as, harassment or, very conservative governments or diversity. It's a hard one. I also felt this a lot with COVID. So I think some of you guys know that I did a lot of work when COVID first started on scaling up testing, and they're now running without me. They don't need me anymore. They're 400 people doing a ton of, the US's capacity of testing. But this was also, challenging that we had to charge for the test, because if we didn't charge for the test, we wouldn't have money to scale up the testing capacity and have the labs function and pay all the lab techs who are working 24/7 to, accession all the samples and see if somebody was positive or negative, and invest in R&D to develop a vaccine and an antibody test and the next versions. And, there was all the things we had to do, and the only way to do it was to have capital, and the only way to have capital was to make money from the tests. But then you also are making money off of a pandemic, but if you don't do it, then there would have been 6% less testing capacity in the US. I mean, Los Angeles is a lot more open now, in part because this company has done almost all of the city's testing. And I think that's just kind of a tug of war. That's my solution is to become a billionaire and then fund things I want to fund and not have to worry about that for my personal projects. But until then, how do you kind of balance trying to do as good as possible without taking advantage of a population, and taking advantage of a sick population if you're working in healthcare? I have no idea what the answer is, unfortunately. It just hurts my soul.
Can I add Jason, do you mind?
Yeah.
There's
Please go ahead.
A question that people at O'Reilly, the media and tech company, tell me they've apparently been just discussing internally for decades. Tim O'Reilly, the CEO, just keeps bringing them back to the question. And the question is, how do you ensure that you create more value than you capture? And basically, he points to this dichotomy, which is, for example, open source projects, very often the creator captures almost none of the value, and so you don't get the kind of growth that you were talking about in the test, which of course is a social good. But then on the other side, you have this situation where companies are simply trying to maximize shareholder value. They're trying to capture as much of the value as they possibly can, and that also doesn't seem healthy. And I guess the O'Reilly discussion anyway, that they have in an ongoing fashion is how to try and find institutional models that steer a middle course between that. So there's these, what are they? I've forgotten the name of the corporations, the new class of corporation,
B Corp?
which
B Corp, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Where they're actually, they're not legally mandated just to be increasing sort of shareholder value, but they can have other missions. It's, I guess, sort of one prototype approach. I don't know how successful it's necessarily been, but it seems like the right kind of thinking for operating in that sort of healthy, I would hope, healthy middle ground.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks. Let's move on to some audience questions. So just to remind everybody again, we've got we're using Slido for the questions. So this lets you write your questions and also see everybody else's questions and vote things up. I don't promise to go in 100% voting order, but it's definitely going to influence me. So let's start with a question from Hyder. How is intersectional research handled? Is there more or less support for research overlapping multiple domains? So I guess this is like interdisciplinary research. Is that does that have a particular challenge in getting handled? Do you want to respond?
I mean, sure, it has a massive challenge in being handled. I think partially because, I mean, just for sort of the most basic reason, which is, of course, program managers, program officers so often have a real, they build their career around particular things. They become expert in particular things. There's almost I think a very natural kind of a politics that arises as a result just of those kind of organizational decisions about how you structure responsibilities. So somebody becomes the person who's responsible for, such and such a gene. And it may just be sort of happenstance that person was ever assigned to that responsibility. And then depending on how good they are at the organizational politics and all these other things, funding may take off there. And yet I think the natural kind of way of things is that when people propose something that falls between those cracks, there is, it is very hard to make a case, mostly because of what are essentially coordination problems. You need a whole bunch of things to happen simultaneously. You need a program officer, you need support sort of within faculty for hiring, you need support from journals so that you can actually publish your results, you need support from the people who provide conference space. All those things need to happen simultaneously, and that's part of what makes these kind of things that are otherwise fall between the cracks of discipline so hard to get off the ground.
Yeah, I can give a case study to this one. So something I worked on a lot when I was back in the lab is I worked in a nanotechnology lab that was developing these really cool DNA templated silver nanoclusters. So basically these very, very small molecules that fluoresce different wavelengths, and you kind of could use them for whatever. But I was also working in a mouse neurobiology lab that was tracking the change of dopaminergic pathways, so basically the reward pathway in your brain, as a result of alcohol intake, which, by the way, alcohol does a lot of weird things to your brain, which is something we learned from the mice. And we had a lot of challenges in this mouse lab of kind of labeling specific neurons and making sure we could see them under a microscope. So I brought over the tech from the nano lab to the mouse lab. And both labs were both independently very well funded, but nobody could get a grant for what I was doing despite the obvious value and kind of need, because it didn't really fall under the alcohol dependency grant scheme, didn't really fall under the nanotechnology grant scheme because it involved mice. So we ended up actually finding a third party rich individual, as I discussed before, to fund some of the proof of concept studies there. And it was just this whole ordeal to do, basically a few studies that ended up proving the point that we were trying to make.
Seems like we need more rich individuals who like science and
more science
and think long term. Yeah.
Maybe more science communication is a good place to start. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from this is either Al or AI. I can't tell from the font. What is the in terms of ethics in biotech, research that has large scale impact versus research with personal but smaller population effects? So I guess that's the question of if your family was affected by a rare disease and you're rich and you want to go fund that rare disease, but it's not going to have the as wide scale population impact. What are the ethical concerns around that?
Yeah, there's actually been a big shift in bio in the last few decades. So it used to be that everybody went after the blockbuster indication. So blockbuster indication being a disease that could support a drug that would make $1 billion a year. And this was really the focus, and nobody looked at rare diseases despite the fact that kind of the whole category of rare diseases is actually pretty common. It's just obviously very segmented by all the different diseases that one could have. And there's a really good book in my bookshelf somewhere about the man who kind of pioneered the shift to actually people focusing on these orphan diseases. So really small diseases that maybe only impacted 1,000, 2,000 patients, but are kind of a very beautiful biological example that you can develop a drug for, help those patients, but also learn something that you then move forward. So I wouldn't say it's like the what is it, the train conductor, whatever problem where, you know, you're saving 1,000 patients or you're saving 1 million. It's actually often you learn something from simple biology that rare diseases often have, relatively speaking, that then you can bring to a broader population. Again, gene therapy being like the canonical example of this, where, you know, we kind of figured out all the weird biology isms that happen in gene therapy and, you know, the eye disease, for example, and helped, you know, 2,000 patients not go blind. But now it's being more broadly applicable to, you know, various cancers that have much larger patient subsets. And if there wasn't a stepping stone, those, you know, innovations might have never made it forward at all.
So let me riff on this and ask my own question. This reminds me, you mentioned orphan diseases, which reminds me that there was some legislation, as I recall, or regulation change not long ago, specifically aimed at orphan diseases. And I think trying to make the FDA pipeline less onerous, as I recall, for, you know, diseases that fit a certain category of maybe, you know, under, I think if they affect under 200,000 people, something like that, then they kind of got like an expedited process. We're also seeing right now with COVID-19 that, you know, the regulatory apparatus is trying to sort of relax itself in order to, you know, just kind of make more things happen faster. If these things are possible, if we can just like relax some, you know, FDA restrictions in order to get more things happening, I mean, why don't we do more of that across the board? Like how much of the FDA pipeline is actually, you know, putting a huge sort of frictional damper on new drugs or on biotech innovation more generally?
I mean, so there's been a lot of changes in regulation, and it's always a risk-reward balance. I'm not sure which one you're specifically referring to. It might be, forgot the exact title. I think it's like emergency exception, where it's if you have somebody who's like an N of 1 disease and you have the ability to, you know, develop a gene therapy for it, for example, then you can give that despite the fact that you haven't been through the regulatory pathway. Or you could, there also are a number of different like orphan disease designation, which will give you expanded patent protection or exclusivity, or, you know, expedited review by the FDA or things like that. There's waivers that save you money. There's a lot of different kind of FDA pathways for expediting drugs that are, you know, for important diseases or for small populations or with the new technology. The sentiment that the FDA is purely a bottleneck is like all these things, like accurate in some degrees and super inaccurate in other degrees. You have to be really careful because there is a 90% failure rate. And that's like, again, a simplified number, but there's a reason why. It's very damn hard to find a drug that works. And there's a lot of consequences when you give somebody a drug that doesn't work, that might even hurt them, that you have to consider. And that a pharma company is going to somewhat consider, but to them, you know, that patient isn't a number. Well, to you, you know, if you take some random drug and it destroys your liver or destroys your kidneys and you have to, you know, deal with that the rest of your life, you know, statistically, you probably learned a lot and you help society as a whole, but that one patient's life is a lot worse. So that's just like a moral issue. And different countries handle it in different ways. For example, I think it's in South Korea, there's expedited pathways where basically you just show safety and then you can get market approval, start selling a drug and improve safety or improve efficacy later on. This is actually how dog drugs work too, for some cases, which is another reason I'm doing dogs. But
in Europe too,
you have a lot of responsibility.
Europe's equivalent of the FDA is, as I recall, is they make you prove safety but not efficacy, whereas in the US we make you prove efficacy.
I don't think that's true.
No?
They're usually everyone follows what FDA wants, and FDA is kind of like the golden standard. There are exceptions for like personalized N of 1 medicines or compassionate use. That was the term I was looking for. So if you're gonna die,
yes,
you can get, you know, some drug. I think that's actually probably the law you're referring to also, because Trump was very much supporting this. But then there was a lot of kind of caveating around that because this gives patients false hope. They don't understand what they're taking, and you don't want to be too paternalistic, but you also don't want to have somebody think they're taking a cure when very high probability the drug's not going to work. And you want to give that to them, but you have to balance it with the conservatism that you need to have in biology because bio is hard and most things don't work.
Yeah.
So again, there's no right answer here, but it's a really hard one. It's a really hard one.
Shreyas asks, oh, did you want to add something, Michael?
Well, just one sentence. Years ago, I saw a statistic that 1 in 60 FDA trials results in serious side effects. And by that, they meant very serious. And that's, you don't want the number to be a lot higher than that. Just to this point about it being, a bottleneck. I don't know how if that's the level already, I don't know how you do that much better.
Michael, have you read Andrew Lowe's work at MIT?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, I love that man. He's written
about.
Oh, sorry.
Which stuff in particular? I've read his stuff on cancer bonds.
He's written a lot of really interesting stuff. The one I'm thinking right now is the bar for statistical significance. So right now, statistical significance is a p-value of 0.05, which basically means the 0.05% chance that what you're seeing is false. And he makes an argument in one paper that actually in certain indications that are incredibly horrible, for example, I'm using neurodegenerative disorders because we have nothing for them and they're pretty broad. So Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, again, the classical examples, where actually you might be okay with a p-value of 0.2 because, an 80% probability that the benefit you're seeing is real is significantly better than the 100% probability of you dying and losing cognitive function. So it is something to think about, something that people are thinking about. But then there's also a responsible man where, if the FDA commissioner changes it, a p-value of 0.2 for certain indications, A, how do you quantify that? B, how do you do it equally across indications? And C, if a ton of people die from a new drug that now is on market and somebody makes a ton of money on it and actually doesn't work at all, who takes responsibility? Well, it's the commissioner who approved that, and his career is now dead, so he's probably never going to do that. And the party that backs that is also going to be responsible for that now. So it's hard to do in reality.
Shreyas asks an interesting question. You can comment on this and or on the premise behind it, which is essentially, can we do better at making sure that scientists who discover big things get rich? Is it a problem that we don't have more, billionaire scientists or something from great discoveries? I don't know. What do y'all think about that?
I think it was one that I pointed out to me that, if the money flowed back to sort of the originator of a lot of ideas, and then was held in trust for their descendants, Isaac Newton's family would be the wealthiest in the world. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't think. I mean, in general, I think scientists who do good work are remarkably well rewarded by society. They don't necessarily become billionaires unless they decide to choose a particular path, but they certainly don't lack for material comfort. So I don't know. I don't have a very strong feeling. Celine might have a stronger feeling about it.
What do you think, Celine?
I don't know if I have a strong feeling. I will say we had I would love scientists to get wealthy or whatever that is that they want, which is probably, to have a beautiful giant lab that looks over an ocean. A lot of the PIs I worked for, that's what would have made them happiest. But we did this exercise in Longevity Fund actually where there was a certain drug that we were translating out. And we were like, okay, well, we know where the drug came from. We know who's going to get equity in the company, technically in the most standard method. But what about all the basal, contributions that went into it? So I tried to backtrack and actually created this hierarchy of all the scientific innovations that allowed for this one drug to be, viable to create a company around. And it was really fun, but then the logistics we wanted to give them all equity fractionally, but the logistics got really, really difficult because, at a certain point, it's like, well, do you give the guy who, discovered, X random thing about, cell receptors something, or, is this discovery worth more than that discovery? And yeah, we didn't end up doing it. But it's something we thought about, definitely.
Yeah. My take on it is that, beyond a certain level of material comfort, I suspect that most scientists are mostly just interested in research freedom. and the ability to do good work and, you know, have all the funding for that, right? I think it's kind of true of inventors and like a lot of folks, it's not actually, the money is not actually the driver or the motivator. The money is the enabler for them to pursue their intellectual curiosity, which is the real driver, the real thing they're passionate about. And so that's why I think we need to find, go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
Can I interject something? Adam Mabelstone, who's a neuroscientist who's at DeepMind at the moment, pointed out to me that there's this really interesting institutional gap we have, which is most fields, not all fields, but most fields are really bad at solving problems which require, let's say, on the order of $50 million. So he sent me a sort of a whole long list of these are, you know, big, important problems that a lot of people in those fields think are very important and would love to see solved. And you could just do it for $40 million or $60 million or some number at that size. And that we have mechanisms for doing certain types of big science where it might cost $500 million or $1 billion, or, you know, that's where the LHC and places like that came from. And we have a lot of sort of individual investigator level science and, you know, small collaborations of such people, but that actually it's pretty hard to form institutions at about that sort of $50 million level. I thought that was a really interesting observation. In some ways, I think that's actually what DARPA in particular has done quite well. Their programs are often about sort of $40-odd million, and they have a very strong sort of a thesis that, you know, it's to say, you know, we need self-driving cars. We're going to have, you know, we're going to spend tens of millions of dollars sort of in very early stage research on it. So in some sense, that's, I think, one of the few instances where it's addressing this institutional lack. But that's certainly, I think, a place where it's not really a question about wealth of scientists, except insofar as Celine said, you know, a lot of scientists would be like, I could, you know, give me $50 million and you know, there's just these problems that I could nail, and I can't. Something like Craig Venter raising, I think it was $300 million for Celera to do the Human Genome Project. I mean, what an incredible thing to have done, you know, to have actually somehow rounded up the cash to do that, to find the human genome. But that's, I mean, such an exception. Really remarkable.
Yeah, those people are so rare. It's interesting you mentioned $50 million because in the sort of pharma pipeline, my understanding is what they call the Valley of Death is actually earlier. It's more like around the $5 million range, where you can, you know, sort of like in the lab, you can get the maybe a couple $100,000 or maybe a couple million to find a drug candidate. But then there's this work to get it ready for clinical trials. So before you put it in humans, you have to do some animal testing, you have to do some toxicity and, you know, kind of various things. So in between the like in vitro, yeah, it kills the virus in the petri dish. And the now we're going to put it in humans. There's this stage of getting it ready that's just really difficult to fund. It's sort of more than you can. It's easy to get in academia, but also it's too early and too risky that the pharma, you know, companies want to do it. Roughly around here is they call it the Valley of Death because just a lot of things kind of don't get through this funding stage.
Yeah, but that's not a money constriction issue. That's just, you kind of nailed it. It's the risk. Right? Like we've cured cancer in a lot of mice. We've done a lot of cool things in mice. And it very often does not translate out. So when you don't have that like super compelling data, it's very hard sometimes. Plus, if you're not paired, I think somebody else was saying this, that kind of the skill sets of, you know, being, you know, very scientifically insightful and also able to raise a lot of money and kind of advocate are not very common. And so the combo of all of those factors make it very difficult to kind of, you know, just get people to suspend belief that, you know, what you found is actually translationally viable. If it seems like it's going to work, there's a ton of money to push things forward, right? Because there's a lot of money to be made in drugs. Or
if it's a big enough market at the end, right? If it's one of those blockbuster drugs, then the sort of risk times potential reward.
Yeah, but those like everlasting blockbuster indications are actually harder sometimes because so many people have shot their shot. It's like Parkinson's, a canonical example of this, where there's so many multi-$100 million, maybe even like $1 billion failures in Parkinson's because we just don't understand it at all. So, you know, if you go out now and kind of pitch something for Parkinson's or pitch something, cardiac disease is another common one where this is challenging. those are massive indications, right? Like millions and millions and millions of people get these diseases, and VCs will often laugh in your face because like why do you have something that's going to work when, you know, the smartest minds in the world have been working on this for decades and it hasn't. Nothing has changed.
Right.
There's money in bio if you can cure things, but yeah, it's the efficacy question that's very, very, very difficult.
Yeah. Did you want to add something on that, Michael, before we go on?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on an analogy to fracking. You know, hydraulic fracturing as a source of natural gas was first done in 1947 by Sonolind, and basically just kind of failed. I mean, it's a little bit like the Parkinson's story. Over 60 years following that, there's just one disaster after another where you put $10 in and you get $8 out. And then almost for sort of random reasons, about 2000, George Mitchell put, I think it was $6 million in, and they just happened to find the process that worked. And, I mean, utterly changed the world. And it's sort of, I don't know what moral to draw from that. I'm just thinking, you know, in some sense, in Celine's Parkinson's example, you want to be George Mitchell, but it's such a, when you read the details of that story, it's such a random thing. It didn't have to have happened that way, and they did a bunch of things that were just a bit lucky.
Yeah, a lot of it's luck in bio, which people hate to hear. But like realistically, this is the sphere of information around, you know, all the biology of Parkinson's. You know, we know like that much, and you know, you might develop your drug in that area of knowledge, but realistically, you're just going to get lucky that your drug is also relevant to the whole sphere of bio that's relevant to that disease. And at a certain point, you can't really control. Like I always say that there's definitely a God, and it's, you know, it's biology. Like there is an ultimate truth in bio, and you just don't know it, and you have good luck figuring it out. You don't have enough brain power to cognate it.
We got a question I would love to get to. So it's from an Ahmed, who's an 18-year-old going into life science research, and wants some career advice. He's interested in not only producing impactful research, but also helping to, you know, shape the field and reshape research as a field. What's your advice or thoughts for him?
Michael, should I start or you?
Well, you're certainly more a life scientist than I am, and I think that's extremely relevant in this instance.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll caveat this that everybody always gives the advice of to do what they did. So I'm really biased, but what I did that I thought was really helpful is I went to UT Austin. You know, it's a great school. It's not Harvard. It was fine. I had a scholarship, meant that I had time, and I didn't have to work all the time to be able to work in a lab. And that's something I'd really recommend, is get into a lab as soon as you can. Wash dishes, do boring things. It doesn't matter. Just get into a lab and you'll get opportunity, and also start reading scientific papers as soon as possible. So often they'll teach you out of textbooks. The textbooks are great for, you know, getting the basics of biology. Once you go a little bit, even if you start going specialty at all, it actually, most textbooks are either too broad brush or kind of inaccurate in bio. Like neuroscience is really famous because like the biology of neuro, what we understand of neuro, you know, changes a lot. So obviously read your textbook, but also read papers and kind of get used to reading papers. And it's going to be really, really hard. Like for the first year, I remember it taking like a day to read a paper, but you'll get the skill eventually. And it'll be really helpful for you if you have that ahead of your peers. And the other thing I would say is start immediately kind of understanding how scientific hypotheses are done, and try to get the opportunity to work on a creative project. So for me, it was, or one of them was the nanotech thing that I was mentioning earlier, and that kind of helped me get the attention of my peers, attention of other scientists, and it also kind of taught me how to think through scientific problems, so that just you can't get that from reading a book. Like you really have to think through your own problem and see how everything goes wrong to really understand how science works. And yeah, I mean, the standard path is grad school. It really depends what you want to do, but I'm still split on that one. Ask me in 10 years if I regret not finishing my graduate degree. But there is a lot of, like the hard thing with bio is just a lot of incumbent knowledge, and it's a little bit difficult to get that without being near a lab, and the lab is in academia usually.
I'll just quickly second the advice to read papers. I think for a lot of people, especially if you haven't been all trained up, it might seem like an impenetrable barrier, or like something that's just sort of beyond you. But actually, I think papers are surprising, especially the really well-written ones, are surprisingly accessible, and you should just dive in and try to do it. And the worst thing that happens is you'll read a sentence and you'll realize, I don't even understand all the major words in this sentence, and then you just start looking up the definitions of those terms, and you go to Wikipedia, or you go to whatever your source is, and you'll actually very rapidly build up enough knowledge to like get at least the gist of papers, and that can be super valuable. So don't think it's inaccessible.
I think Michael has a really good blog post on how he reads papers that I would recommend.
Ooh.
I do, and I'll try and share it. I don't know whether it's really good, but I have a blog post.
It's good.
In fact, I have a few things. I'll send them.
Great. What's your advice to a young researcher, Michael?
To some extent, well, first of all, actually, let me say that I strongly agreed with I think almost every single thing Celine said. So very worth reflecting on deeply, I think. Maybe two extra comments. One is just a detail to amplify something Celine said. A colleague of hers, in fact, Laura Deming, who started working in, I think it was Cynthia Kenyon's lab when she was about 15 or 16, told me that something she realized she could do very early on was just find the thing that would be useful for other people in the lab and do it. And she gave me the example, which has really stuck with me, that just taking notes and distributing them at meetings is great. Everybody gets value from it. You learn a lot from it, and you start to you're integrated, you're contributing. It's maybe not particularly glamorous work, but it's kind of a way of getting started. And Laura, she just gave me a whole bunch of examples of just little things like this, which almost anybody can do, but nobody actually does do, or almost nobody does do. And that's really stayed with me. And I've sort of since noticed that a lot of people, particularly people who are just getting started, who do that, like it seems to serve them really, really, really well. So that's one comment. And I think the other comment I would make is about taste and about the fact that I think that's almost the most important thing you cultivate as a researcher. So really starting to develop your own sense of what is important. So you will hear a lot about what is fashionable, and you can sort of drill down on it, and you can start to develop your own sense of what's important, why it's important, understand kind of the pathways through which important work is done. A colleague of mine once said that she rejected somebody coming in to be a grad student in a lab, and she said that they were very, very enthusiastic about everything, had stellar kind of a background, but they didn't have any opinions of their own. They were almost sort of too keen on everything. She said she would have been happier in some ways if they said, I really don't like this and this reason, and I really do like that. And it was more important that they be thoughtful about the reasons and that they have some sense of themselves and what they believed was important. And that's something that takes a lot of time and sort of a lot of reflection. And it's one of the reasons to read papers is that you gradually, the first moment at which you read a paper and think, this isn't a very good paper, or this is wrong, is actually really kind of profound. Like that's actually kind of you really participate in some kind of a conversation, and before you can get to that, in the page, which may be bad as well, but you don't necessarily, you haven't thought deeply enough yet to get to that. So yeah, that sort of gradual years-long process of cultivating taste is, I think, just tremendously important.
Yeah. While Michael was talking, I wrote down 4 words that I feel like at least are very important when you're kind of an early researcher, and it's being humble, both about your understanding of a subject, because that when you think you understand something, you've only hit the tip. And even if you understand everything that's ever been written about a subject, there's a lot that has not been written on because nobody understands it. So humbleness in science is really, really important. Being skeptical is really important. Being rigorous and being optimistic within all of that too. And I try to balance those four as much as I can. And when I have not, usually in the humbleness category. So, you know, thinking I understand something about how some certain area of biology works and then getting thrown in my face that I don't. That's usually where my mistakes have occurred.
Great. Well, we're just a little over the 90-minute mark. So let's thank our panelists and wrap up here. I would like to give each of you a moment to say if you've got, if people want to follow you, if you want to give your website, Twitter, or, whatever it is that they can follow you and learn more about you. Celine, how can people follow you?
This might be difficult because I have a very hard name to spell. But I am on Twitter at Celine, CELINE HALIOUA. Sorry, Moroccan. We have hard names. And then, yeah, I mean, that's the main thing. And everything that I post about science and biotech is usually rooted via there.
Great. And Michael.
I just stuck, while Celine was talking, I put it in the chat, which I'm sorry, folks, I haven't been able to properly keep up with, but yeah, you can see my Twitter username. And that's probably the easiest thing to do if you're interested.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much. And Anna, should I just turn it over to you for a moment? Anything you'd like to do in terms of wrapping up?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so you can follow Jason Crawford on Twitter as well, and The Roots of Progress, which is his initiative. For Interintellect events, it's very creatively interintellect.com. Thank you so much for being here. We will stick around a little bit very casually, do like a jam session after the show. So if anybody wants to stick around for as long as Jason can stick around, we will be here. Thank you so much. And see you at our next events.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael and Celine. This was a great chat and really appreciate your time.
Of course. Bye, all.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.